A couple weeks ago, we started a new series, and it's one of those series that I think is ironic for many reasons. We started a series called Right on the Money, and the ironies in this series are really two things, and I want to highlight them before we dive into the actual text this morning. The first irony is that we call this series Right on the Money, and we want to be right when it comes to financial issues, and yet very frequently, financial issues are the one area where we are often very wrong. And the evidence of our wrongness on financial issues is the constant stress and the strain and the anxiety and the worry that we have around our bills, that we have around our savings, that we have around the demands that are on us. There's nothing that speaks to our failure in this regard like the tension that we all live in. I mean, one of the things that every week it's kind of hard for me because I know we talk about money. I know for some of you that's such a big deal right now that it just stirs stuff and you go, I don't even want to talk, I don't want to talk to my dog about money, much less to come to church and talk about it, right? Because there's anxiety. I just think it's important for us to acknowledge that irony, that as we look at this, we need to acknowledge that as much as we want to be right on this issue, we're very frequently wrong. And when you and I can actually stop and admit that there's a place where we're really wrong, and you know this to be true, like you know this probably better than I do, when you know you're wrong about something, that opens up an opportunity for learning, doesn't it? Like as soon as you acknowledge and you say, wow, I really blew it, that's usually, if you're a smart person and you've figured out life a little bit, that's usually when you go, okay, I need to figure out how to do this. So that's an important irony. The other irony that I find about this topic and this issue is that a lot of us that are in the room, and I'm not assuming that all of us in here are Christ followers or that all of us are really trying to live the gospel out robustly, but my assumption week after week is that many of us are. And those of us that have been doing this for a while, here's what we've discovered. We've discovered that in a lot of areas of our life, whether that be how we relate to people that we're in relationship with, whether it be how we work or how we recreate, whether it be how we understand our experience of purposefulness or meaning in our lives, what many of us have discovered is that the gospel and the message of Jesus frequently present ideas or manners in which to pursue those things that are not only contrary to what culture presents, not only contrary to what our society tells us we should do in those areas, but also fulfills us significantly more than any methodology that our society or culture presents to us. And that's just an observable fact. If you take relationships, sexuality, if you take any of these issues, many of us would say, but I have so much evidence in my life of listening to a contrary message that the gospel told me about this category or that category of my life, and when I pursued it, I found peace and joy and happiness and meaning like never before. Interestingly enough, and here's where it's ironic, those of us that have experienced that, somehow and for some reason, we don't assume the same when it comes to financial issues. Comes to money, and we just function with money like everybody else is functioning with money. And it's as if we would say to ourselves, is the prevailing understanding of sexuality in the world today something that all of us should just ascribe to and say, let's pursue that? Many of us would say, well, my experience says absolutely not. There's no way I would do that. Well, why would we assume that our culture is presenting a way of dealing with finances and resources and money in a way that makes as much sense? And so these ironies in this cause us to stop and say, what if the Bible presented something completely different? What if there was another gospel-oriented perspective? What if the renewal that Jesus offers us in so many other categories of life had the potential of renewing this category of life? What if there was more to this? That's the heart of this series. That's why we are talking about how you and I can be right on the money. And my hope every week as we walk through these different nuances of this conversation, that we would walk away and say, man, there's a shift that's taking place. There's something happening in my thinking regarding this very significant issue in my life. And so today what we're going to do is we're going to actually look at a resource or actually a tool or a way of evaluating how we're doing in this regard. I mean, I think so many times when we pick up the scriptures, there's an opportunity to look at something and evaluate. It's like a window or a door opens up and we're able to see ourselves more clearly. And when we see ourselves, we can then make some sort of assessment and say, how am I doing in this regard? And that's the way we're going to look at this today. There's this tool that we're going to get. There's something that we're going to look at. And what it has to do with, and this is going to be interesting for some of you, it has to do with what you and I do with our extra money. What do we do with our extra money? We're going to look at today what you do with your extra money, because what you do with your extra money, what you do with the extra that you have, says a lot about what's happening in your heart and in your life regarding financial issues. Extra money. And I know what some of you are thinking right now. Can I go get coffee? Because I don't have any extra money, right? I mean, as soon as I said extra money, some of you chuckled, didn't you? You're like, extra money, right? Extra money, yeah. In fact, most of, if you were sipping coffee when I said extra money, you were dangerously close to spewing it out on the person in front of you, weren't you? Like, extra money, that's funny, right? Like, that's really funny, because who has extra money, right? I have these friends, they love to recreate and do different things. They bought a Volkswagen bus last year. She's a teacher out in the valley, and he works in Idaho. And they bought a Volkswagen bus, and they took it down to Oregon. And they were kind of cruising around, and they are not your typical hippie-type people. So they were amazed at the inroads they had into the hippie culture of southern and central Oregon. And they were telling this story. They said they pulled into this supermarket, and this girl pulls up, and they were like filling up their water bottles for their bikes and taking care of some camping provisions and things like that. And they said like the windows rolled down and smoke just kind of billowed out of the windows. And she says, "Hey man, do you guys have any extra weed?" And they looked at her, and they were like, "Well, we don't smoke weed." And then as she's like, "Oh, that's cool," she drove away, thought, is weed something that people just have extra of? Is that the way that culture is? Like, if you got some, you probably got some extra, right? Like, that's never the case with money, is it? Like, you never, like, can you imagine people pulling up in the parking lot, "Hey, you got some extra cash?" You know, just, you'd be like, no, like, we don't ever have extra money. Like, our response to that, which is why this is so challenging and why this resources is so pivotal for us to understand and really evaluate by, because most of us, when we think about having extra money, we say, well, that's somebody else. There's somebody else out there that has extra money because I don't have extra. But let me just present this. Let me just let you think about this. If you've, I don't want you to raise your hands, but if you've seen a movie in the last month, you have extra money. Like if you've gone to a movie, you have extra money. Right? If you have a coffee habit, some of you know who I'm talking to, right? As we see you all day long in the drive-thru, right? If you have a coffee habit, you have extra money, don't you? You're like, no, I need that to survive. No, right? And some of us would agree with you on that. We don't really want to be around you when you're uncaffeinated. But if you have those kinds of things in your life, you have extra money. If you've grabbed dinner with your family, if you went out and got a pizza with some friends, you have extra money. That's extra money. If you have found yourself replacing something that you own that works with something else that's incredibly similar to what you just were replacing it with, but it's just a little nicer and a little better, you have extra money. You know what I'm saying? There's this term called upgrading. We're going to talk about that more in the next couple of weeks. If you've upgraded anything that worked, you have extra money. Like if you upgraded something and what you upgraded still was working when you upgraded it, you have extra money. That's just a fact of the matter, right? Like you have extra money. If you take a vacation, you have extra money. Like you have extra. If you have a hobby, you have extra. If you've had a garage sale, you know you have extra, right? Isn't this funny? Like we're a group of people that someone says, "Hey, do you have any extra money?" And we go, "No way, no extra money." Then you have a yard sale and there's all this stuff. And what is all the stuff you sell at your yard sale? It's extra, isn't it? Isn't it amazing how people that don't have extra money somehow accumulate extra stuff and turn their lawn into a shopping mall, right? And people are walking around and perusing and just like, "Hey, isn't this great?" You're like, "Well, this is my extra stuff." But you don't have any extra money. Well, I know, I didn't back then, but now I have this extra, right? I mean, just a garage sale alone tells us we've got extra, right? So there's all these little things, but let me just take this to another level. The truth of the matter is this, and when we think about this very long, all of us, if you have a roof over your head, if you're living indoors, you have extra. You recognize that? If there's food on your table on a fairly consistent basis, in the world that we live in today, you have extra. If you have a car, one car, you have extra. That's extra. And what we're looking at today and what Jesus says today, and by the way, I'm not condemning having extra. I'm going to make this very clear. What I want to make clear is Jesus presents a question regarding how we manage our extra, what we do with our extra, that reveals a lot about our heart. What we're looking at is, what do we do when we have extra? What do we do when we realize that we have extra? You go to a third world country, some of you have done this, you've traveled overseas, and maybe you've served in an impoverished neighborhood. Maybe you've crossed our town and gone to neighborhoods in our city where the standard of living is incredibly different from the one that we find this building in. And the moment that you find yourself there, you have this unbelievable sense of gratitude, don't you? Like, you suddenly realize it doesn't take very long in your exposure to someone who has less to realize that you have more, right? And suddenly you realize, I do have extra. Unfortunately, what also happens to us is that we go to the lake and we see people's extra houses, and we see people's extra places on the mountain, and we see the extra stuff they have sitting empty, and we go, well, I don't have extra, that's extra, right? And then we work to have that kind of extra, right? Our culture is always doing that. It's always saying, you don't have extra, they have extra. You keep working towards that. But the truth is, we have it. We have it. And what we're going to look at today, and what Jesus says about how we handle this, is a strong indicator of how close you and I are to getting right when it comes to this money issue. So we're going to look at this story where Jesus, he found himself speaking to a group of people, and you need to know this. Jesus is speaking to a group of people who are not affluent. They are actually impoverished. They're being oppressed by a government entity that's over them. They're overtaxed and they're overworked. And yet Jesus, speaking to a group of people who are stressed out about money and have way less than you and I do, he has the audacity to dive into the conversation about their extra. I think that should tell us something about Jesus' desire for us to hear what he has to say on this issue. So the story we're looking at is found in Luke chapter 12. If you have your Bible, you can turn there, and if you don't, the words will be on the screen. You can follow along as we walk through this. Luke chapter 12, about midway through the chapter, the situation that's taking place is that there are these two brothers, and Jesus has been teaching the crowds, but there are these two brothers that come. And when these two brothers come, they're fighting over their father's inheritance. Their father has passed away, and now they're debating, like, who should get what. And so they come to Jesus to have him resolve this tension that exists now in this family. This never happens. Like, I know this is an ancient, Near East issue, right, where family members fight over inheritance. Like, that doesn't happen in our culture. It doesn't happen in our city. It doesn't happen in our church. Like, none of you know what I'm talking about when I say this, but hopefully you can get the picture, right? They're fighting over their dad's stuff, even though their dad is gone. And what Jesus says, instead of resolving the dispute, what Jesus says is so radically unexpected that it informs an entirely different way of us thinking about money. He begins by making this statement. He begins by this, and this is interesting because the first thing we're going to read, you're going to agree with. You're going to go, that's true. You're going to agree with it intellectually, but I'm not sure you agree with it in reality. Because listen to this. Listen to what he says. In verse 15 of Luke chapter 12, it says, Jesus said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Now, first there's some shocking vocabulary at the beginning of this where he says, take care. It kind of reminds us of something we talked about a couple of weeks ago, where Jesus was very strongly warning us against the potential of us being overcome by financial issues, of us being overcome by greed and wealth. In the same dialogue, or the same sort of way, he uses this sort of vocabulary saying, take care, be on guard. This is language of an ongoing battle. This doesn't go away. Be on guard against covetousness. Why? What does covetousness do that you need to be on guard from it? Essentially, he says, your ability to covet, my ability to covet, to want more, to need more, to continually be upgrading, improving our situation, eventually that will warp us into a place where we begin believing that the essence of our life, the very place where we find meaning and purpose, is around the accumulation of stuff. If you covet and it goes unchecked, eventually you will find your life built on and around the accumulation of things. So guard against that, because that's not what life is. Your life is not the sum of your material goods. And you know what most of us would say? In this moment right now, we'd say, he's right, right? We agree. I mean, if you agree with this, right? Like most of us, you listen, you go, okay, I can agree with Jesus on this. This is actually something like you can say, this is right. That's true. But the narrative of our life says something incredibly different. We see it on paper and we say, there is no way that my life is the sum of my house and my cars and my bank accounts. And yet the narrative of our life, the way we respond when those things leave us, when they're taken from us, the way that we protect them, the way that we obsess about no one getting their hands on them, the way that they can immediately destroy a family vacation, the way that these things can utterly crush a family, ruin a marriage. The narrative, the stories of individuals who lose everything and jump out of buildings because of it, that tells us something about what we truly believe. We may intellectually say, no, I know when I'm really pressed to it that my life isn't the abundance of these things, but because covetousness has gone unchecked in our hearts, the truth of how we live says something completely different. We affirm the reality that our life is the sum of our stuff by how we live. So Jesus says, guard against this. Guard against this. Don't let this insipid covetousness take over your life. Like two brothers who are fighting over their dead father's things. So Jesus, he warns, and then he goes on to tell them a story. And this is the story that he tells in verse 16. He says, the land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops. So this begins with a guy who is actually very well off. This is a guy who has extra, right? Like when somebody says, do you have extra? People look at his neighborhood, they go, oh, that guy's got extra, right? He has extra. And now, not only does he have extra, but he has extra, right? So Jesus presents quite the dilemma, right? What am I going to do with all this money? I mean, sometimes don't you all find yourself in this place? Like, you just have piles of cash, you're just swimming in it, you're like, what am I going to do with all this, right? Like, real dilemma, right? That never happens to any of us, but it happens to this guy, right? But it's a great point. This happens, and he's, what am I going to do with all the money, all this stuff that I have? And that question, when he asks that question, that is the pivotal question, that when he asks that, and when we ask that, it unveils the fundamental issue at the heart of what we're talking about. Our answer to the question, what do I do with all of this extra, reveals everything. How do I respond to this? That shows where I land in regard to the money issue. And whether you realize it or not, whether you understand this or not, every single time that you get more than what you have, it's a raise, somebody gives you a gift, an investment grows, something flourishes. Every time that happens in your life, whether you do it cognitively or not, you answer this question. Every time you have more, somewhere in the process, when that hits your hands, you make a decision, whether consciously or unconsciously, you make a decision that looks like the decision that this man's about to make. You choose something. What do I do with this extra? Now, some of us, we are so defaulted in answering one way that we don't even have to ask the question anymore because we know what the answer is. We just do that. We have this response that we have all the time because of this. So the question that we answer is really answered in our actions. Do we save it? Do we recalculate? When you get extra, when you find out you have a raise, is the first thing you do, you say, oh, you know what? We can finally afford this. And so you start calculating a new payment plan. Is that the first thing you do? Is the first thing you do start, oh, there's that thing we've been saving for, now we can, is that the first thing you do? That tells us, do you spend it right away? Do you just say, hey, let's just go have fun, is that what you do? What we do when we have extra, when we get more, reveals our basic beliefs about money and life more than anything else. And so the man responds, when he asks the question, what should I do with all this money? He says in verse 18, I'll do this. I'm going to tear down my barns and build a larger one. And there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I'll say to my soul, listen to the terminology, to my soul, to the very essence of who I am, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. You, soul, the very essence of who you are because of what you have. Now you can finally relax and eat and drink and be merry. You will finally have enough stuff that your soul can rest. What's this telling us about him? I've been blessed, and I'm going to build bigger barns. I've got enough to consume now, and I've got enough to consume later. Isn't that the point? And then the story takes a turn in verse 20 that nobody sees coming. But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul that you're so excited about having rest in is going to have a new kind of rest. This night your soul is required of you, and the things that you've prepared, all the stuff that you've done to save and build up, and all the extra that you've accumulated in your life, whose will they be?" Like, where is this stuff going to go? All of this that you thought was the meaning and the purpose of your life, the abundance of things, what does it matter now? And this unexpected response, when Jesus says this radically shifts the thinking of the people who are listening. He calls him a fool, and they would have been thinking, wait. I mean, the man would have responded, "Wait a second, you're calling me a fool. This looks like anything but foolishness. This looks like wisdom, looks like saving, it looks like me being prudent." And the people around him, listening to Jesus in the story, anecdotally saying this, they would have listened and said, "Why are you calling this individual a fool? Why would you say this?" It's because this individual is believing two myths that were true in that culture. Every culture has myths that they believe, things that we think will provide ultimate answers to ultimate questions, but in the end, they never satisfy. All of our cultures do that. Every culture in history has cultural myths, including ours. Interestingly enough, the cultural myths that are revealed in this, and there are two of them, are identical cultural myths to the ones that we have in our culture today. This individual, this man, there's two fundamental misunderstandings. The first one is this. If you're taking notes, maybe you should write this down. He completely misunderstands what it means to be blessed, and so do the people who are listening. The response of, "Why would you call this guy a fool? Why would you do that?" The surprise that would have been on their faces is a direct result of those individuals having a basic misunderstanding of what it means to be truly blessed. And so that's the first myth, is this guy doesn't know what blessing is. The second myth is an understanding of why you have extra. There's a total misunderstanding of the reason that you have extra or more in the first place. And let me talk about these two things. In a culture, and in that culture, as it is in our culture, people correlate financial gain with the blessing of God all the time. And I know I just said that, and some of you just went, "Well, what's wrong with that?" Everything's wrong with that. It is a complete mythology within the church. And so if you're a Christ follower and you've been believing that God's material blessing of your life is a sign that you have favor with him, that is a complete untrue myth. There's no place in the Bible that teaches that. Material blessing, material financial gain, like there is no correlation between financial gain and God's blessing, and yet we do this all the time. When we say we're blessed, oftentimes what are we talking about? "Well, man, I'm so blessed." Well, I'm referring to how nice my house is and how shiny my cars are and how much food I have. So frequently when somebody says, "Oh man, we received this," and I don't want to make anybody angry or frustrate you a lot, maybe just a little bit, but I want you to think about how many times you say, "Oh man, that was such a blessing." Why did you say that? What was it in regard to? I hope it was in regard to your grandkids coming over and hanging out at your house, because that's a blessing, right? But oftentimes we say, "Man, I was so blessed with," and we fill in the blank, and it's an object or it's an amount on a check, isn't it? Like, that's the way we think. We correlate God's blessing with financial gain. I hear people say this all the time, "God blessed me with," and that means money, and that's a myth. What you have, what you possess, is not a reflection of God's blessing in your life. Your material possessions and your balance in your checkbook is not a reflection of God's pleasure with you or God's blessing in your life. Here's why I know that. I know too many people who are blessed by God who have absolutely nothing. And they are completely blessed and completely aware of how blessed they are. And on the other side of it, I know plenty of people who are apparently blessed by God and they want nothing to do with God. Our culture is filled with people who have all kinds of financial wherewithal. It didn't come from God, right? So this myth leaks into the thinking of not only this man, but all of us. This guy has a story that everybody is jealous of. Like they would have looked at it and said, "Oh man, God's blessing. I wish that was my story. More crops, bigger barns, way to go." And Jesus says, "No, you're a fool for thinking that way. You're a fool for thinking that. That is absolute, utter foolishness to live your life oriented in that direction." And he lives that way because he believes another myth. He believes that he assumes that everything that comes into his hands is for him. It's his. That the extra was given to him so that he could use it, he could spend it. He could, the reason he was profitable, the reason that he got the raise, the reason that he was given what he was given, the reason that he has what he has was for him, for his provision. He believes that myth to be true. He's not a fool because he's rich. I want to be clear about that too. The richness is not what makes this man a fool. It is not the amount that he has. It's the fact that this man believes and assumes that everything that he's been given is for him. He's bought into the lie that life is not only about stuff, but when I get stuff, that stuff was given to me for me. And he even says, my soul can be at rest. My soul, you gave this to me so that I could be okay. This was about me. And Jesus says, you don't know what blessing is, and you don't know why you have what you have to begin with. And the parable ends with this man running out of time before he runs out of money. I know we often hear the opposite. You're going to run out of money before you run out of life, right? And so save, and build. But more often than not, people leave this planet, and what they ran out of was time, not money. Not food, not shelter, not in our culture. This man ends up giving his stuff away, not because he was generous, but because he was dead. That's a really bad way to start being generous, right? I'll eventually be generous when I'm gone. And you realize Jesus is telling the story in front of two brothers who are fighting and saying, Jesus, resolve this. We want to fix this. We want to know who gets our dad's stuff. And he goes, your dad's stuff. Like he tells this story in front of them. Then he pulls out of the parable and he looks at the crowd and he says, I'm done telling the story. Now I just want to challenge you. And he gives them this warning. Verse 21, he says, so is the one. Like anybody can be this guy. So is the one means you too can be the fool if you want to be. So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. In other words, your life and my life can look exactly the same as this guy. Total loss if it looks like this, if we live this way. And people will be fighting over the stuff that we turned into life. They'll be picking through it at a rummage sale, at a garage sale. People will be picking through the things that we made the essence of who we are and discarding them like yesterday's trash. And it will look like a loss if we continue to live this way. But there's this if dynamic to this. If you do this, which means you have a choice. If you believe that everything that comes your way is for you, your life will look this way. If you believe that every time you get a raise, if you believe that every time you get a gift, if you believe that everything that lands in your hands was given to you for you to do with what you want, you will hear somebody say, what a shame. What a fool. It's utter foolishness. But it doesn't have to stay that way. We all have an opportunity to be rich toward God. What does that look like? This conversation spirals into a private conversation with the disciples in the next few verses down. Jesus begins to talk to them about not being anxious for anything. And he talks about the birds of the air. Some of you know this, right? He talks about how the birds of the air are fed and how they're clothed and how the lilies of the valley are beautiful. There's this whole beautiful picture of all of the imagery of God providing for those that he loves. And he's talking about not being anxious. And then he moves down into verse 33, and there's this point that he makes. He says, sell your possessions and give to the needy. Like, get rid of your extra and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that don't grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. Quit worrying about your stuff. Why don't you do something you don't have to worry about? For where your treasure is, remember we started the series with this, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And let me just remind you, remember, your affections follow your actions. When you are rich toward God, your love for God and your relationship with God grows exponentially. It is not the other way around. You don't just get affectionate and then start acting a different way. We begin by moving towards God. And so Jesus says, give, be generous. Make generosity a staple of your life. Be a generous person. Make sacrifices and help others. Be the kind of person, I sometimes wonder about this, like when was the last time that I myself, and this is an evaluation of when was the last time I worked as hard to get something for someone else where I had zero gain from it? When was the last time I bent over backwards, worked hard, labored so that somebody else could have something and it didn't benefit me in any sort of way? That's what Jesus is saying. Be rich toward God. Ultimately, what he's saying is for us to acknowledge that our God has an understanding of humanity and what he hopes for us. He sees the injustice in our world. He sees the poverty and the pain and the heartache. He sees the places where people need meaning and life, where people need education and training. He sees all of these things, and he says, give your life and give the resources that I'm giving you to these things and allow what I dream of in the world to flourish. Be rich towards me. Invest in my mission. Invest in what I'm doing in the world. Sacrifice for the things that are good and bring wholeness and hope to the places where we live. That's what he's talking about. Be rich towards God. And he says, when you do that, when you and I make a difference, we shift from thinking that everything we have is for us to a place of understanding that we get to participate with God, something happens and our perspective changes. And peace around the number one issue that causes anxiety in our life suddenly comes. And joy is suddenly laced through our conversations. And a lightness in a place where there was heaviness is suddenly delivered to us. That's what happens. So we love the way generosity looks on other people, don't we? Don't you love the way generosity looks on others? This week I'm reading a book called Humilitas, and it's about humility, which the guy starts off and he pretty much says, how do you write a book on humility and claim to be an expert? That one's going to be a slow burn for some of you. But in one chapter, he was highlighting all these individuals who exhibited just beautiful generosity and humility, talking about Albert Schweitzer. And those of you that know Albert Schweitzer's story, a man who was an incredibly successful individual, incredibly highly regarded individual who went to medical school midlife and moved to the jungle and served underprivileged populations for the rest of his existence. An unbelievable act of sacrifice and giving of himself. It's this beautiful thing. And when you read the story, I've never known anybody to read Albert Schweitzer's story and go, that guy's an idiot. No, everybody goes, man, that's beautiful. I don't know if it's me, but it's beautiful. There are so many stories. Mother Teresa, there are people that you know. You have friends that have sacrificed and given, and they sweat blood for causes that have nothing to do with them. And when you look at them, don't you look at them with honor? I mean, isn't there a part of you that when you see somebody who's giving generously, someone who's sacrificing, somebody who you know, like they could live one way, but they're living this way because they're giving like when you see that, there is something that wells up inside of us, and we go, that is beautiful. That is epic wonder. We look at it and go, that is an amazing individual. But here's what's fascinating about that. So many times when we see somebody walking on the street and they've got a great haircut, what do? We go mimic that haircut, right? Or somebody's got a really nice wardrobe, and we go, man, I'd like to have a wardrobe like that, and we attempt to have that wardrobe. Somebody's got a new car, and we go, man, I'd love to have that car. I think that would look good on me. There are so many things in our culture that when they look good on others, we say, I want those things for me. That looks good on you. I'm going to work at making that look good on me. Why is it that when generosity looks so good on other people, we don't work to make it look good on us? It's so beautiful on others. Why is it so difficult? We love it and respect it so much. Why do we have this deep tension inside of us? Because we're believing myths. We're believing things to be true that are not true. And they're defining us. They're defining us. I had this image this last week of thinking about this. You know, whenever you see an image of a dog who hasn't eaten for days and suddenly a bowl of food is put down before them, what do? They consume it, don't they? They're just like, it is this ravenous moment. Or you see an individual, like maybe on reality TV, like Survivor, who hasn't eaten for days, and suddenly they win the award, and they go to the island where there's all the food. What do? They gorge themselves, right? They gorge themselves on all of the things. It's like, I haven't had any. And there's a part of me that when I see a starving dog or a hungry human being with a plate of food in front of them, they behave that way. There's an acceptance. There's almost an acknowledgement of pity and just like give them that moment to be nourished. But the image that I have for myself and maybe for so many living in our culture, it's as if we're sitting at a table and we've just gorged ourselves on food, and then we shove away from the table completely full, and we dive beneath and we pick up the scraps and we're scrambling for them when we've had more than enough to eat. I just wonder, is that the perspective of this fool? Is that what Jesus sees when he sees us? Does he see us and go, what are you doing? You're diving under the table and grabbing scraps when you've just eaten to your fullness. You have so much. And that's why Jesus says, take care. Be on guard of this. Be on guard. That means that there is intentional, thoughtful activity regarding this. You cannot be on guard emotionally. If you allow your emotions to be the definition of your being on guard, you will not be on guard, right? When it comes to being generous and being rich towards God, not being covetous, you cannot do that emotionally. It is not good enough just to say, well, I feel really generous. I just feel generous today. Really? What are you going to do about that? No, nothing. I just feel generous. It just feels good to feel generous, right? We're going to start there and slowly work our way to actually being generous, right? No, you have to do something about it. And so I'm going to challenge you. I want to challenge you to do this. And here's the challenge. You can't just feel this way. You actually have to think about, are you generous? Well, how do you find out if you're generous? The great thing in our culture is we have a measurement tool. It's called our checkbook. You can find out how generous you really are. So I want to challenge you to do this. I want to challenge you this week. Some of you have already done this because you did your taxes and you got a statement. Maybe your statement that you got from Summit or anywhere else that you gave this last year, maybe you didn't get all of that gathered together, but I want to challenge you to do this. I want you to look at this week how much you gave away. Put a number to it. Add it up. I want you to look at how generous you have been, to actually sit down and say, okay, how generous am I really? Like, what have I really given away? And start adding it up. And like, maybe it's $4 or $5 in a hotel room when you're traveling on a business trip, and you think about that and you go, you know what? I tipped a little bit extra. I'll let you estimate. You want to round up to the nearest $3 or whatever? Do that. Have fun with it, right? Make yourself feel good. Add the numbers up. Add them up. And I want to challenge you to do this, to start thinking, because the only way that you will know whether or not you are being rich toward God is if you can actually look at it and see it. And here's what I want to say. Don't be content with the numbers. When you get the numbers of what you gave away, for many of you, you will look at it and you'll go, man, that's a lot of money, right? Like, I know this is the temptation for me. For me, when I look at the amount of money that I give away, I very frequently start thinking about what else I could have done with that money, right? Usually it involves a toy, right? It was a car, it was a boat, it was a vacation for my family, it was something like that. I frequently do that. And so that money, that amount starts to look bigger and bigger. The more I think about that, here's what I want to challenge you to do. When you get the number, I want you to think about your income. And I want you to figure out the percentage of your income that money represents. Because some of you might go, man, I gave $1,000 away. That's a lot of money. What percentage of your income was that? How much of what you were given did you give away? Here's the startling statistic. In America, the average American gives away less than 2% of their total income. So the assumption of that would be this. I'm not talking about churches. I'm talking about the average American. Average American gives away less than 2%. So the assumption would be this, that that God is giving us 100%, and man, it takes 98% to get by. Whew, things are tight these days, right? By the way, politicians, on average, give significantly less than the average American. Just saying. This is just I know some good politicians, but the stats aren't good there for politicians. Usually less than 1%. Less than 1%. So I want to challenge you to do that. Did you give away, did you keep 98%? See, there's something that happens when you go, man, I feel really generous, like I did this. There's something that happens when all of a sudden you look and you go, wow, I kept 98, 97, 99, 100% of what landed in my hand for myself this year. There's something that happens. The number that you add up and go, that was really generous. There's something that takes place when you go, wow, did I really use 99% of everything that landed in my hand for me? I was rich towards God with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5%. Like, is that what I was rich toward God? Is that where I benefited humanity with what God gave me to steward for Him? There is a reality check when that happens. And I'm never going to be the person that's going to stand up here and say that, there's some sort of percentage-based standard that you need to apply to your life. Here's the standard. The standard is, are you giving sacrificially? Is there a place where it hurts? Do you look at your life? And I want to challenge you to do this. To give percentage-based giving. I won't give you a percentage, but I love percentage-based giving because there's something about it that sets a goal and you say, I want to do this. I want to be this generous towards God. I think I can live on this, and I think if I work really hard, there's a way I could give this away and be rich towards God. And maybe next year, we grow that by 1 or 2%, and we increase our generosity towards God and what He's doing. And by the way, I'm not saying this, I'm not telling you this because Summit needs money. If you want to give this to other organizations, if you want to give it to somebody that you see on the sidewalk, down the street, wherever, the question is, what percentage? Are you setting a goal? Have you made a point to be generous towards God? Because it's a big enough deal that Jesus says, you're a fool if you don't. And your life is an anxious, worried mess if you don't. And this issue is eroding our culture and eroding our lives if we don't. So what are we going to do with this? I know for Sherry and I do some consulting outside of Summit, and Sherry has a job, and every now and then, we get a check we didn't expect, and it's extra. And I love my wife for this reason. My wife is significantly more generous than I am. The first question she always asks is there anybody, anything, anywhere that we need to give this money to before it goes into our checking account? I love that she asks. It's like the most beautiful thing when she says that. And I just think, every time I'm like, I kind of don't like you right now, but that's such a fun question to ask, and it's such a fun way to think. And we have grown to love those moments when we go, hey, does Summit need this money right now? Maybe that's where this should go. Maybe there's an organization that needs it. But we know it's extra for us, and so we're going to ask the question, where should this go? What you and I do, what I do with my extra, and what you do with your extra, and I think we all agree we have extra, is a barometer of how close we are to being right when it comes to money. It's a barometer of how close we are to allowing the gospel to reshape and reform this part of our lives. Let's pray together. Would you stand with me? Lord, it is absolutely impossible to end this conversation or to walk away from this study without acknowledging your incredible generosity towards us. And I will say, there is nothing that motivates my richness towards you like the plain and simple recognition of your richness towards me through your Son, Jesus Christ. You have given us all so much. You have given everything so that we could know you. You've given us life and life to the full. And we love the opportunity to give back to you. We pray this in your name. Amen.